from the bustling marketplace life, arrived at a threshold of silence. A journey that shed the predictable clutter of Athenian routine and pressed one against a monumental stillness. The air here felt different, weighted by centuries of belief and revelation. It was not just the physical space, but the sheer density of history that seemed to press upon the shoulders, challenging every notion of certainty the visitor carried from the city. To approach Delphi was to confront a mystery so vast it risked swallowing all personal understanding whole. The path itself felt ceremonial, each step a conscious surrender to something greater than oneself. It demanded not just arrival, but transformation. The sacred precinct unfolded before them, shrouded in an atmosphere thick with smoke and unspoken stories. This place belonged to the chthonic gods, whispering secrets through steam rising from altars far below. The monuments spoke of monumental ambition, of men seeking divine confirmation for matters of state, love, or war. But this grandiosity masked a profound vulnerability, the human need to have one's life dictated by external signs. To look upon the sacred structures was to feel both intensely privileged and strangely small. The sheer weight of tradition here was palpable. Every marble column seemed to hum with unresolved questions, every winding path suggesting an untold narrative or a critical fork in destiny. The philosophers observed this energy, this potent mix of religious awe and intellectual curiosity. They were studying not merely the architecture, but the collective spiritual yearning of civilization itself. It was an overwhelming experience for the rational mind, accustomed to syllogisms and dialectics. Here, knowledge seemed less like a reasoned proof and more like a sudden, shocking epiphany delivered by chance. The mystery surrounding the Pythia, the priestess who sat amid vapor and utterance, was the greatest intellectual puzzle. How could divine communication be so deliberately vague? It offered just enough meaning to suggest profundity, yet maintained sufficient ambiguity to allow any petitioner to construct their own desired conclusion. This was a brilliant cultural mechanism. It ensured that accountability for life's next steps remained squarely with the questioner. The oracle did not provide certainty. It provided the luxury of interpretation. For the philosopher, this was a paradox wrapped in incense smoke. Their entire academic lives were dedicated to finding universal, verifiable truth, a concept clean enough to be written on papyrus and debated fiercely in the agora. Yet here, the most sacred pronouncement offered only shimmering clouds and serpentine suggestions. The divine wisdom seemed inherently messy, resistant to reduction or definition. It was a rebuke to the neat boundaries of syllogistic thought. The silence itself held as much weight as the whispers. It forced introspection into an unfamiliar territory. One could not simply argue away the monumental presence of the god rock, nor dismiss the sheer scale of human devotion carved into the stone. The initial intellectual impulse was to categorize, to analyze the religious customs, and predict their cultural impact. But this rigorous detachment faltered in the face of genuine emotional gravity. It forced a confrontation with the pre-rational, with instinct, fear, desperate hope, the raw core of the human spirit that philosophy often sought to refine away. The initial understanding was one of academic distance, observing the rites as ethnographic data points. But soon, the boundary between observer and participant blurred. The weight of all those seeking counsel, the parade of lives hung upon these cryptic pronouncements, began to resonate with a deeper anxiety. It suggested that perhaps the pursuit of ultimate knowledge was not simply an intellectual exercise, but a fundamental pillar supporting the very structure of human self-worth. The smoke, therefore, became more than mere ambience. It was a veil between the known and the unknowable. The silence became less an absence of sound and more the loud presence of unvoiced fear. These were potent, conflicting forces that caught the philosophers off guard. They arrived seeking definitive answers to philosophy's eternal questions. What is justice? How does man live well? But found themselves faced with a different question entirely. Who are we when stripped bare by overwhelming possibility? The sheer scale of the experience suggested that some truths simply defy language, defying the neat grammatical structures and logical progressions taught in the schools. This was a moment of profound intellectual humility. The academic framework felt suddenly inadequate before this vast, echoing mystery. The air itself felt thick with expectation. Having walked the sacred ground of Delphi, we brought with us not only our robes and sandals, but the heavy baggage of 1,000 assumptions. To arrive here was already an act of submission, a voluntary intellectual surrender. We came ready for pronouncements, for clear-cut answers that might restore order to our troubled lives. Yet, what greeted us was something far more unsettling than divine certainty. We stood before the chasm between reason and mystery. On one side, there was the meticulous logic of sophist debate. Every claim required proof. Every premise needed a syllogism. We were trained to seek cause and effect, for the elegant symmetry of human thought. But here, at Delphi, cause seemed arbitrary and effect whispered. A visitor, burdened by a question so enormous it threatened to tear his life in two, finally approached the priestess. He asked about the future of his city, or perhaps merely the salvation of his soul, a query meant to anchor him against the rising tide of uncertainty. It was the ultimate human vulnerability made audible. Then came the response. The Pythia spoke not with clarity, but with a cascade of symbols, words that seemed both ancient and utterly random. They were beautiful, yes, woven with divine cadence and poetic gravity, yet they were maddeningly vague. Like smoke curling up from cold stone, their meaning dissipated upon closer inspection. The silence that followed the utterance was deafening. It was a void into which our disciplined minds rushed to pour their theories. We were confronted with ambiguity itself. This was not the clean answer expected in the schoolyard, or even the sharp conclusion of a well-formed argument. This was interpretation. This was the burden of making sense from nothing. In our philosophical training, we valorize precision. We build edifices of thought using perfectly cut blocks of fact and logic. When faced with such fluidity, with words that could mean everything or absolutely nothing, our tools felt blunt, inadequate. We were intellectually frustrated. To the rational mind, this silence after the whisper was a challenge far more profound than any paradox. We began the exhausting work of interpretation. Each passing philosopher gathered in clusters, turning their faces toward the cryptic message. One sought political meaning. He saw warnings of foreign enemies and shifting alliances. Another focused on ethical guidance, believing it spoke to individual virtue and piety. A third treated it as a biological metaphor, interpreting life cycles through seasonal references. Every person heard something different, and in that multiplicity lay the profound truth. The answer was not meant to be singular. By delivering such an ambiguous oracle, Delphi did not merely offer prophecy. It imposed a critical test on the recipient's intellect. It forced us away from the comforting need for guaranteed resolution. The weight of interpretation became a kind of mental quicksand. If we were too literal in our reading, we risked misunderstanding fate. If we ignored the profundity of the utterance, we risked dismissing guidance meant only for the soul. We found ourselves caught between certainty and doubt, between the solid ground of syllogistic truth and the unstable mist of the divine word. This encounter forced an uncomfortable shift in our intellectual priorities. Our minds, so accustomed to finding a leads necessarily to be, were instead presented with a chaotic cloud where it might lead to anything or nothing at all. We had to learn to value the potential ambiguity itself. The uncertainty was not a flaw in the message. It was the core of its wisdom. I realized that the divine, unlike human debate, does not operate within the constraints of logical cause and effect as we understand them. Divine communication must therefore transcend our neat little categories. If the answer were simple, it would simply be irrelevant. Thereby, the mystery itself became the subject of study. We began to treat the ambiguity not as a problem to solve, but as a necessary element to accept. This required an immense form of intellectual humility, the painful admission that some profound truths defy our best reasoning skills. It was a quiet revolution in understanding. Sometimes, knowing that something is unclear is the most vital piece of knowledge we can acquire. This subtle shift in perspective proved more transformative than any straightforward prophecy could have been. Delphi taught us to widen our lens, to stop demanding clean lines and perfect conclusions. Instead, we learned to dwell within the liminal space, that fertile ground between understanding and misunderstanding. For it is precisely in this ambiguity that true philosophical growth takes root. It is here, suspended between what was said and what might be meant, that the self begins to truly question its own rigid assumptions about what constitutes truth. We learned that the greatest wisdom often arrives draped in the deepest obscurity. The young philosopher felt the weight of Delphi not merely as a history lesson, but as a visceral clash between his practiced mind and profound mystery. He had spent years mastering the elegant certainty of syllogism. If A equals B, and B equals C, then A must equal C. This framework was the bedrock of his academic existence, the shield against confusion. But here, in this sacred place, logic felt like a beautiful cage built around an uncontainable spirit. The cryptic whispers emanating from the Pythia seemed to mock his intellectual edifice. The divine answer, given with such solemn authority, yielded nothing but mist and suggestion. He had expected clarity, a pronouncement that could be traced back through clear premises to an undeniable conclusion. Instead, he found only possibility, veiled in smoke and ancient ritual. He sat by the columns, running his fingers over the cool, worn stone, trying to reconcile the structured world of lecture halls with this nebulous encounter. The scholarly pursuit had taught him how to dismantle arguments, how to find the flaw in a premise or the gap in reasoning. Yet, Delphi demanded he suspend all such tools. It required an act of radical intellectual disarmament. The truth, he began to realize with a sickening jolt, was not a carefully constructed syllogism. It was messier. It clung to the edges of understanding like smoke. Logic assumed that if you gathered enough knowledge, the answer would eventually precipitate into clean form. But Delphi suggested that some truths simply resist clean articulation. The young man looked at his peers and sensed their similar internal struggle. They were accustomed to the certainty of the textbook, the satisfying closure of a proven theorem. To confront ambiguity in the face of the divine felt less like an academic exercise and more like a spiritual collapse. He remembered moments from his studies where he believed he had grasped a universal principle, a guiding law of human nature or ethics. These principles, when examined under the harsh light of genuine experience, crumbled. They held together only through the sheer force of definition, not through inherent reality. The burden of the scholar is this: the endless assumption that complexity can be simplified into a neat formula. He sought universal truth, believing it must exist as a crystalline structure, visible and definable to the disciplined mind. But the sacred whispers suggested otherwise. Perhaps truth was fundamentally relational, dependent on context, shimmering with ambiguity. It required not just knowledge of concepts, but an acceptance of what could not be pinned down or categorized. The human attempt to map the divine realm onto a diagram proved woefully insufficient. He started comparing the solemn pronouncements he had heard here, vague warnings, suggestive images, with the rigorous certainty demanded by Plato's dialogues back home. One was an interpretation of pure intellect. The other felt like the breath of something vast and untamed. The intellectual architecture he believed in suddenly seemed flimsy, built upon assumptions that reality often ignored. The scholar began to understand a profound paradox. The very desire for universal truth, the desire to contain meaning within a single system of thought, might be the greatest impediment to wisdom itself. It is in the willingness to accept contradiction, to inhabit the space between two opposing ideas without needing to choose a victor, that true learning might reside. He realized that his entire scholarly life had been geared toward elimination, eliminating error, eliminating exception, eliminating doubt. But perhaps, to become truly wise, he needed to embrace what was discarded by the syllabus, the ineffable pauses, the unanswered questions, the comfortable murkiness of not knowing. The silence after a great prophecy felt more educational than any booming declaration. The weight of knowledge became an unbearable pressure, replacing the satisfying relief of discovery with the exhausting anxiety of endless possibility. He was forced to abandon the comforting structure of if/then reasoning and simply listen, truly listen, to the quiet suggestions of his own confused heart, mirroring the subtle guidance he perceived from the divine oracle. The greatest intellectual humility, he concluded, wasn't knowing that you knew nothing. It was accepting that what you thought you understood is merely a partial glimpse, subject to shifting light and interpretation. The scholar's journey, he learned, must pivot from the library stacks outward into the demanding openness of existence itself. The echoing silence of Delphi no longer felt sacred. It felt immense. It pressed upon the mind like an invisible weight, a constant reminder of questions too vast and profound to contain in simple syllogisms or reasoned debate. Having faced the veils of prophecy and emerged with nothing but ambiguity, a masterful, unsettling gift from the Pythia, the philosophers now found themselves trapped between certainty and doubt. Their initial intellectual excitement had cooled into a restless anxiety. Every pronouncement, every whispered suggestion, echoed back not as divine guidance, but as an echo within their own unsettled minds. A new tension began to build among them, the unbearable pressure of having to know everything, or at least the desperate need to be right. They were accustomed to the clarity of academic discourse, where premises led inexorably to conclusions. At Delphi, the conclusion was always open air. This gap between structured logic and mystical vagueness started to breed a profound self-doubt. The desire for a definitive answer morphed into a paralyzing fear. What if our interpretation is flawed? What if we have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the divine whisper? It began as an internal argument, a relentless mental interrogation. Was wisdom merely a matter of assembling the right arguments, or was it something messy and uncontainable like smoke? For one philosopher, this doubt took physical form, a knot in his stomach, a restless energy. He paced among the ruins, not because he needed to move toward an answer, but because he needed to outpace the anxious thoughts clawing at him from within. The fear was less about the world's mysteries and more about his own inadequacy to grasp them. The whispers of Delphi had unearthed a vulnerability that academic certainty could never touch, the crippling terror of being wrong. This fear wasn't simply admitting error, it felt existential. To be uncertain meant potentially having misunderstood life's most crucial lesson, or worse, questioning his entire method of understanding. The implications were staggering. If the foundations of knowledge, the syllogisms he had so carefully constructed over years, could fail when confronted with a simple cryptic utterance, then what foundation did any intellectual belief truly rest upon? He stopped pacing by an altar dedicated to Apollo, running his hand along the worn stone that bore witness to millennia of hopeful inquiry and subsequent disillusionment. He felt exposed. His carefully constructed scholarly facade seemed paper-thin against the vast indifference of the mountain air. The ambition to reconcile all contradictions, to build a perfectly ordered map of human knowledge, suddenly seemed less noble and more brittle. The internal dialogue became frantic. What if nothing matters? If fate weaves its tapestry outside the reach of our reason? If Apollo's message is fundamentally unintelligible and merely prompts us toward deeper bewilderment? Then what purpose does rigorous thought serve? This paralyzing question threatened to negate years of dedicated study. The weight of expectation, both from the gods and from his own mentors, felt crushing. He contemplated the irony of their journey. They had sought external truth in a holy place, only to find that the most challenging questions were those directed inward. Delphi was not merely a source of prophecy. It was a grand mirror, forcing them to view the messy landscape of their own intellectual egos. The scholar realized that his passion for objective knowledge often masked a deep-seated need for validation, the need to prove himself capable of understanding the ultimate reality. This craving for epistemic certainty was perhaps the greatest illusion of all. This period of anxious introspection taught him a brutal, profound lesson about the self. The anxiety was not born from external threat. It stemmed entirely from the internal gap between what he thought he knew and the limitless nature of existence. He began to see that striving desperately to resolve every ambiguity, to find the single truth, was itself the greatest source of suffering. The very pursuit of knowledge, when taken with excessive intellectual arrogance, becomes a cage. The echoing uncertainty forced a radical shift in focus. If certainty is unattainable, if the nature of reality is inherently ambiguous, then perhaps wisdom lies not in grasping answers, but in mastering the quality of our questions. It meant learning to tolerate that uncomfortable space, the fertile ground of genuine ignorance, without spiraling into panic or self-reproach. He started viewing doubt not as a failure of intellect, but as its most critical and necessary function. Doubt was the humble admission that there were limits to his understanding, and that acknowledgement itself was an act of profound courage. This shift was agonizing, demanding a dismantling of his scholarly identity piece by painstaking piece, replacing it with something more resilient, less defined by definitive answers. The whispers of Delphi had done more than merely cloud the mind with prophecy. They had unsettled the very foundation upon which knowledge was built. Hours passed in a state of suspended decision, standing at what felt like a literal crossroads. The grand pronouncements from the Pythia, meant to provide undeniable clarity, had instead created an overwhelming paralysis. Every path forward seemed fraught not with obvious danger, but with profound ambiguity, leaving the heart uncertain and the intellect reeling. The philosopher who had arrived seeking a definitive answer, a syllogistic conclusion that neatly tied cause to effect, premise to perfect realization, now found only branching uncertainty. To act required assumptions, and assumption, after days spent grappling with divine vagueness, felt dangerously fragile. He looked at the path stretching before him and realized that certainty was not merely absent. It was an illusion he had brought into this sacred space. The true weight of Delphi was not in its oracular power, but in its capacity to dismantle established intellectual comfort. It taught them a brutal lesson. Sometimes, knowing what you should do is less valuable than simply accepting that there might be no single right answer at all. The journey had forced them away from the pristine certainty of the academy and into the messy reality of human choice. This realization was difficult to swallow. It meant discarding the neat logical frameworks, the cherished patterns of academic thought, in favor of a commitment that felt almost impulsive, a leap based not on absolute knowledge, but on limited, whispered confidence. The moment became a crucible of will. To wait for another divine whisper meant accepting endless stasis. It meant letting paralysis dictate action. But to move forward meant embracing the potential inaccuracy, the unknown variable, the very flaw in their pristine logical equation. One character spoke, tentatively at first, voicing the anxiety that had become common among them. What if our logic is irrelevant here? What if the most profound truth requires abandoning all systems of categorization and analysis? This question hung in the air, a challenge directed as much at Delphi's divine authority as it was at their own deeply ingrained intellectual pride. The wisdom they sought seemed to operate on a different axis entirely. It suggested that while reason maps the predictable world, only action navigates the unpredictable. The time for contemplation, for assembling airtight arguments and universal truths, was over. They were forced toward a threshold where theory dissolved into mere potential energy. This crossing was more than physical, it was philosophical. It meant deciding whether to remain rooted in the safe certainty of indecision, or to commit to forward motion even when the map is incomplete and the destination remains obscured by mist. The gravity of this choice settled deep within their bones. They recognized that intellectual humility was not merely accepting limited knowledge. It was recognizing that some knowledge must be earned through experience, not derived from pure thought. The whispered ambiguity became a catalyst for movement itself. They began to turn away from the towering mysteries and the grand altars. This physical turning symbolized an internal one, a gradual but irreversible pivot away from the quest for the ultimate answer and toward the difficult, unpredictable act of simply doing. Action, they realized in that quiet moment, held a primal truth far more valuable than any oracle's pronouncement. It was an active participation in life, rather than passive reception of wisdom. This departure served as the first necessary severance from pure intellectual speculation. The lesson learned at Delphi was not know this, but act anyway. To choose action over certainty meant accepting risk, yes, but also embracing a kind of wild freedom that no rigorous logical proof could ever guarantee. It meant trusting in their own flawed human judgment when all divine guidance had faded into an echoing silence. After the dizzying confusion of the oracle's pronouncements, after the exhausting weight of attempting to fit divine mystery into neat lines of syllogistic logic, something shifted. It was not a grand revelation, but a sudden, profound quietude. The philosophers had reached a standstill. They were weary of demanding certainty from the ambiguous whispers of Delphi. Their minds, trained for decades in the perfect structure of argument and proof, found themselves useless against an answer that defied clean categorization. The pursuit of definitive knowledge, so central to their lives, suddenly felt impossible here. It was a kind of intellectual exhaustion, yet it birthed a unique clarity. In this moment of pause, confronted not with a clear path nor a simple truth, but merely with the vast space between ideas, one philosopher recalled a fundamental principle, a pillar stone of wisdom that had been overlooked in the heat of their questioning. It was the core teaching of Stoicism. Nothing outside oneself truly holds power over one's inner peace. The external events, whether the riddle posed by the gods or the flawed logic presented in any textbook, belonged to the cosmos and were therefore beyond individual control. What remained entirely within their grasp, the locus of their freedom, was their own judgment, their reaction, and their acceptance of reality as it unfolded. This realization acted like a cool stream over a feverish mind, instantly calming the frantic need for external validation. They had spent so much effort trying to control the narrative, trying to predict the outcome based on preceding causes, that they found themselves paralyzed by indecision. Their wills were tied up in the desperate quest for a flawless formula that would make sense of the glorious confusion surrounding them. But wisdom whispered that clinging to control was not only futile but actively detrimental to peace. The tension settled into a deep, contemplative silence. The air itself seemed thick with resignation, not of defeat, but of surrender to the process of living as it truly is, uncertain, unpredictable, and profoundly human. They watched the passing light shift across the sacred ground. For so long, they had viewed knowledge as an acquisition, something to be gathered, catalogued, debated, and stored away in a carefully constructed syllogism. They treated truth like a finished edifice, requiring only enough effort to admire its perfect symmetry. But Delphi taught them that wisdom was not an edifice. It was the steady breath taken within the ruins of expectation. The immediate future, therefore, ceased to be an object of intense intellectual scrutiny. It became merely another unfolding moment, indifferent to their hopes or fears of absolute knowledge. The anxiety, which had been driving every single academic pursuit since they arrived at the plateau, began to dissipate. This was the Stoic pause, the recognition that mastery lies not in knowing all the answers, but in mastering the art of living with insufficient information. The sheer act of stillness became an act of radical philosophical defiance. By ceasing the mental struggle, by simply accepting the confusing reality of the moment, they were performing a profound intellectual breakthrough. They were learning to detach their inner peace from the outcomes of external events, whether those events were prophecies or political upheavals. They began to recognize that the chaos they had spent time fighting was not randomness itself, but rather their own resistance to what they could not control. The desire for clarity, when faced with true mystery, simply became a source of unnecessary suffering. To live virtuously, they realized, meant embracing this necessary ambiguity. This pause gave them space to breathe, a monumental difference from the relentless intellectual pressure that had defined their lives until this point. It was the moment where abstract theory finally yielded its authority to lived practice. They were learning, in the quiet of Delphi, that true freedom begins only when one stops demanding reasons and simply accepts existence itself. The profound lessons whispered here were not pronouncements for future kings or conquering armies. They were gentle instructions for navigating the difficult business of being human. The air at Delphi still held the residue of profound confusion. The voices of the gods, though magnificent and terrible in their ambiguity, had taught us a critical lesson. Certainty is often an illusion, a polished facade that cracks under the weight of true inquiry. We came seeking answers to life's grandest mysteries, the meaning of suffering, the path to virtue, the nature of the cosmos, and instead, we found only mirrors reflecting back our own internal struggles. The divine whisper had initially guided us to look outward, toward oracles, toward fate, toward cosmic mandates. But as the dust settled and the initial shock wore off, a quieter realization began to surface. The questions we brought with us from the academy, the meticulous syllogisms, the desire for universal truth, felt increasingly inadequate when compared to the chaotic mess of genuine human experience. It was here, at this crossroads of sacred revelation and rigid logic, that the true philosophical burden appeared, the anatomy of our own worry. Our distress had always been attributed to external forces, misfortune, capricious gods, or intractable political realities. We saw struggle as something happening out there, outside ourselves, waiting to be analyzed or overcome by a perfect formula. But profound ambiguity, and perhaps the very exhaustion that follows confronting the divine mystery, forced us into a quiet self-examination. If external certainty is unattainable, where then does worry originate? Is it truly caused by the events themselves, or is there something else at play? The contemplation moved from the grand sweep of fate to the minute workings of the human mind. We began to dissect our deepest anxieties, those nagging worries that accompany every potential failure, every unanswered letter, every uncertain dawn. We realized these anxieties were not merely reactions to difficulty. They were built upon a foundation of faulty judgment. The true architecture of worry, it seems, is not external pressure, but internal narrative. Our fear is rarely of the problem itself, but rather of our judgment about that problem. The trouble arrives as raw material, a loss, an illness, a defeat, and our minds immediately build intricate, often catastrophic, stories around it. We assign enormous, disproportionate weight to potential outcomes, transforming simple inconveniences into existential threats. This distinction proved shattering. The philosopher had always labored to distinguish between what is good and what is bad. But this process was fundamentally flawed because he treated bad as a concrete external entity that needed fighting or proving wrong. Yet, the moment we paused and examined the mechanism of worry, we saw it dissolving. The event merely is. Our insistence on its catastrophic meaning makes it worrisome. This insight carried immense liberation. It was not enough to simply understand the Stoic mantra, to live according to nature or reason. We had to unlearn the automatic narrative function of despair. Worry is essentially a preemptive judgment. We are judging that something bad will happen before it has even begun. We build mental scaffolding around hypothetical pain. The profound realization was this: our capacity for distress lies not in the variability of the world, but in the disproportionate strength of our own interpretive judgments about that variability. We do not suffer from events. We suffer from how we choose to narrate those events internally. The difference between simply encountering difficulty and being overwhelmed by worry is therefore not one of degree, but one of judgment. The weight that had initially seemed to pull us toward the mystery, away from clean academic logic, now found a new focus: the rigorous scrutiny of our own internal grammar. We began to observe the subtle moments when anxiety seized us, the sudden pang before making a difficult choice, the sleepless night filled with hypotheticals. In these moments, we trained ourselves to intervene not by offering another philosophical treatise, but by asking one simple question: what judgment am I currently attaching to this reality? The shift from fearing external chaos to mastering internal interpretation, was perhaps the greatest lesson Delphi could offer us. It taught us that genuine tranquility is a matter of disciplined attention, a continuous reevaluation of our assumptions before they solidify into worry. We learned to treat potential distress not as an inevitable destiny, but as raw data, needing only observation and reasoned acceptance. This self-mastery became the quiet culmination of the journey at Delphi. The gods had shown us that predicting fate is impossible. The scholars had shown us that absolute truth is elusive. Now, we found a truth that was entirely within our control, the manner in which we choose to judge the things that do happen. To recognize this separation, that the mere occurrence of an event has no intrinsic value judgment attached to it, and that only our mind lends that gravity, this is where freedom resides. This disciplined withdrawal of emotional investment from external uncertainty is not merely self-help. It is a profound philosophical architecture capable of transforming the anxious spirit into one of calm resilience. The weight of the oracle's pronouncements had done more than challenge their intellect. It seemed to have stripped away the comforting certainty they held so dear. They had journeyed from the grand theories of the academies, expecting revelations etched in clean syllogisms and universal truths derived from rigorous debate. Instead, they found whispers, vague, magnificent, and frustratingly personal. This profound encounter with divine ambiguity left them at a precipice. Their minds yearned for definitive answers, yet the truth offered by Delphi seemed to reside perpetually just out of reach, masked by poetic haze. Having spent days wrestling with what was said and what was not said, they began to feel an exhaustion that transcended mere fatigue. It was the weariness of profound interpretive effort. It is into this deeply unsettled state that the Cynic entered. His presence was a sudden disruption, a jarring note in the solemn chorus of contemplation. He did not kneel before the sacred rock, nor did he attempt to decipher the divine mystery with academic rigor. Instead, he observed them all, the grave intensity of the scholars, the bewildered searching in their eyes, the weight of expectation hanging from every gesture. His approach was marked by a peculiar kind of detachment, an observer who seemed utterly unburdened by the need for sacred revelation or absolute certainty. He regarded Delphi not as a source of ultimate truth, but merely as another performance, another elaborate ritual built upon inherited belief. The Cynic's commentary arrived not in shouted outrage, but in a series of measured, unsettling observations, a low, knowing chuckle that carried the weight of all human pretension. It was a laughter born of immense intellectual freedom and perfect disregard for established narratives. He spoke to their deepest anxieties. The anxiety of the scholar who believes his careful system can explain everything. The anxiety of the seeker who fears missing the true answer inscribed in the stars. The anxiety, perhaps all of them shared, of those who cling desperately to a definition of meaning. He seemed to gently mock the inherent desperation that underpins humanity's quest for meaning. He challenged their premise entirely. Was wisdom found only through divine intervention? Must every profound human query be answered by an oracle? Or was perhaps the greatest deception not the ambiguity, but the very belief in a single grand narrative to begin with? The Cynic argued that they had been treating life, and indeed, philosophy itself, as if it were a closed syllogism. As if the divine mystery or the complexities of moral existence could be neatly fit into the rigid boxes of academic logic. Yet, reality, he suggested, was messier. It flowed like water. It contained contradictions that defied categorization. He looked at their intense faces, etched with the struggle between pure reason and messy feeling. He seemed to imply, what if your entire pursuit, your magnificent theories, your painstaking analyses of fate or ethics, is simply a sophisticated attempt to avoid confronting the present moment? What if the greatest revelation is not a prophecy whispered from smoke, but the simple, unvarnished act of being conscious right here, right now? The great narratives, those sweeping stories about destiny, universal laws, the dictates of the gods, or even the ultimate structure of human knowledge. These grand tales, he suggested, were merely comfortable distractions. They allowed people to postpone the hard work of self-confrontation. It was easier to debate Plato's forms or interpret a vague prophecy than it was to sit with one's own unguided consciousness. The Cynic's philosophy was radical in its simplicity. Reject the overarching story, reject the need for external confirmation, and focus on the immediate integrity of self. He urged them to dismantle their expectations, the expectation that knowledge must be transcendent, or that life must make sense according to a neat formula. He proposed a kind of intellectual dismantling, viewing complexity not as an obstacle to overcome with more learning, but as the very texture of existence. The profound lesson carried by his laughter was that ultimate wisdom might not be found in mastering external mysteries, nor even in perfecting internal logic. Perhaps it lay in the simple, defiant act of accepting life's unscripted chaos. The most meaningful response to existence might simply be an awareness, unburdened by the weight of seeking certainty from anywhere, be it a sacred shrine or a brilliant treatise. The echoes of Delphi were fading, yet the weight of its mysteries remained, not in cryptic whispers from the earth, but within the careful architecture of the philosophers' minds. They had traveled so far seeking definitive answers etched by prophecy, searching for a divine syllogism that would explain the messy patterns of human existence. But after days spent confronting ambiguous pronouncements and navigating the treacherous waters of interpretation, they found themselves standing at an intellectual precipice. The journey to know the gods had forced them into a profound confrontation with what remained stubbornly beyond knowing. We began to ponder the nature of fate itself, or Moira. Was destiny a predetermined script written by forces unseen? Or was it merely the cumulative weight of choices made in fleeting moments? This question pressed upon their souls like a heavy curtain on a stage they could never fully illuminate. The ingrained belief of academia had taught them that truth was attainable through rigorous logic. If premise A and premise B are true, then conclusion C must follow. But Delphi had shown them the beautiful imperfection of reality. The prophecies refused such clean closure. They felt the tension between their academic tools, their syllogisms of certainty, and the overwhelming sprawl of existence, which seemed resistant to neat categorization. To acknowledge that something might simply be indeterminate was to dismantle an entire edifice of learned belief. It required a monumental surrender. This confrontation led them past mere questions of divinity and into the deepest recess of self-understanding. What is our relationship to fate? Was everything we experienced, from the rising sun to the smallest heartache, merely a thread already spun into the tapestry of necessity? If so, were our struggles for free will an elaborate illusion? The weight of this realization was not paralyzing, but profoundly freeing. To realize that certain outcomes were beyond the reach of even their most acute reasoning forced a shift in focus, from trying to predict or control the external world to mastering the internal landscape of acceptance. The challenge became less about deciphering the Pythia's words and more about accepting life's fundamental randomness. They began to observe the patterns that resisted explanation, the kindness of strangers without cause, the sudden turn of fortune through no discernible mechanism, the quiet persistence of a blooming flower despite harsh winds. These were not mysteries to be solved by an equation. They were simply realities to be witnessed. The weight lifted when they understood the subtle but powerful difference between resisting fate and accepting its flow. Resistance, they found, was itself a terrible expenditure of energy, a constant struggle against the inevitable tide. It bred anxiety, fueled worry, and created the suffering that had so plagued their discussions up until this point. The philosophical student who had prided himself on intellectual control realized that controlling the future was an impossible task, perhaps even a ridiculous ambition. Wisdom, in this light, became less about knowing the perfect outcome and more about maintaining perfect composure within uncertainty. They started to think of life not as a series of problems to be solved by superior logic, but rather as a river, a continuous, irresistible current moving toward the sea. Our individual lives were mere rafts upon that water, tossed and turned by currents both grand and small, driven by forces we could never see or arrest. The moment they grasped this metaphor was like an intellectual sigh of relief. Resistance was futile. Instead, their focus narrowed to finding the perfect way to be carried. How do you live well when you cannot choose your destination? The answer lay in mastering the vessel itself, the mind, the spirit, the immediate action. The cynical voice, which had previously mocked their search for grand meaning, now found a strange resonance with this idea. If life was inherently random and predetermined simultaneously, then perhaps the highest art was not finding a single truth, but cultivating an appreciation for the moment of becoming. To be fully present in the ambiguity. To perform well, ethically, within the limitations of one's own agency, regardless of where the river ultimately flowed. The grand narratives of fate and free will collapsed into a single, elegant realization. Acceptance is not passivity, but the highest form of engagement. This contemplation led them to redefine struggle. Suffering was not caused by external misfortunes, the loss of wealth, the sickness of kin, or the capriciousness of gods. Instead, suffering arose from the violent cognitive dissonance between what they desired, absolute control, perfect predictability, and what reality inevitably delivered, chaos, chance, flux. To live, therefore, meant performing an ongoing internal negotiation, continually recalibrating their judgment away from demanding certainty, toward embracing the profound liberty found within accepting what is beyond us. This understanding was the true oracle of Delphi. It spoke not in veiled pronouncements about distant kings, but in the deep, quiet realization of personal liberation. The lesson they carried forward was simple. Do not fight the current. When you recognize that certain outcomes are held outside your immediate sphere of influence, held by necessity, by history, or simply by chance, you conserve your most precious resource, emotional energy. You cease wasting effort battling the uncontrollable and instead dedicate it to perfecting the controllable. Your virtue, your reaction, and your commitment to mindful presence in this precise breath. This was not merely a philosophical conclusion. It was an instruction manual for surviving the messy reality of being alive. For weeks, the pronouncements of Delphi had served as an intellectual enigma. They had sought answers from stone and smoke, drawing conclusions that were often paradoxical or utterly meaningless. Their quest was outwardly focused. They searched for divine truth written on the wind, hoping to find a universal law etched into the cryptic whispers of the Pythia. But the deeper they delved into this external mystery, the more distant their initial goal seemed to become. They had approached Delphi expecting a monumental revelation, a definitive answer that would reshape their entire understanding of existence. Yet, What confronted them was not a grand prophecy delivered by Olympian gods, but a profound, unsettling quiet. The magnificent temple complex, once seen as the epicenter of divine knowledge, now presented an impenetrable veil. Their search for wisdom had reached its natural stopping point. It seemed that all the echoes and riddles surrounding Delphi were merely mirrors reflecting something far more internal, something hidden deep within the self. The sheer weight of their accumulated knowledge, the intricate syllogisms, the carefully constructed arguments regarding fate, necessity, and desire, suddenly felt inadequate, almost frivolous. All these structured attempts to define reality through reason had failed to provide a final key. They found themselves in a strange disquiet, realizing that external authority could not be mapped by pure logic. The true locus of truth did not reside outside the human mind in sacred smoke. It resided within the fragile, messy territory of their own awareness. The journey shifted from questioning destiny to scrutinizing consciousness itself. If wisdom was not found in the pronouncement of an oracle, nor in the flawless structure of a syllogism, then where did its source lie? The implication forced a dramatic internal pivot. Perhaps the greatest mystery of all is not fate or divinity, but the human mind grappling with its own existence. They began to understand that genuine knowledge was less about acquiring facts and more about refining the internal landscape. It meant changing the question entirely. The conversational exchange that followed was quiet, moving away from dramatic pronouncements toward a humble dialogue with their inner selves. This was not the kind of wisdom proclaimed in booming speeches, but whispered into the silence. The self became the primary subject of study. What did it mean to know oneself? Was the soul merely a complicated machine capable of processing inputs, or did it possess an irreducible capacity for quiet insight? They started asking questions that had no academic answer. Questions about regret, unfulfilled potential, simple contentment, and the delicate balance between striving and accepting. The former urgency, the desperate need to categorize, predict, and control life through perfect reasoning, began to fade. This self-interrogation was intensely difficult because it required them to dismantle their most trusted tools, their assumptions about themselves. To know oneself meant confronting flaws that logic could not solve and emotional responses that pure reason could not govern. It exposed the contradictions inherent in being human. They recognized that the person they thought they were, the meticulous logician, the eager seeker of certainty, was often a carefully constructed facade, built to manage the anxiety of uncertainty. The self-knowledge required was uncomfortable work. It meant accepting contradiction, recognizing that one could be simultaneously determined by fate and free in their choice. It demanded integrating the brilliant insights gleaned from external philosophical texts with the messy, unpredictable reality of living moments. This integration process forced a radical humility. The certainty once sought through argument was replaced by the profound awareness of unknowing, and it was this profound embrace of unknowing that became the true wisdom. The quiet understanding that one's most valuable intellectual resource is not an external theory, but an honest dialogue with the self. The philosophers began to realize that every grand philosophical school, Stoicism, Epicureanism, Platonism, was fundamentally just a method for achieving this single goal, returning home. Home was not a physical place, nor even the sacred grove of Delphi. It was the deep, still chamber within their own chests. The journey back into selfhood required abandoning the theatrical trappings of grand inquiry and embracing simple observation. They learn to pay attention to the subtle shifts in mood, the persistent hum of anxiety that accompanied every perceived lack of knowledge, and the unexpected moments of perfect clarity when they simply stopped trying so hard to think. This inward focus was a reversal of everything they had traveled for. They did not need an oracle to tell them who they were. They needed only the silence to hear it. The wisdom they sought from the smoky ambiguities of Delphi was ultimately contained within the conversation happening between their own heart and mind. It demanded not certainty, but acceptance. Not a grand formula, but quiet attention. In this final chapter of realization, the philosophers understood that true enlightenment is not a sudden flash of divine insight, but the steady, patient act of observing one's own consciousness in undisturbed repose. The journey's end brings not a clear prophecy, but a profound stillness. Having spent days suspended between the infallible logic of syllogisms and the tantalizing ambiguity whispered by the Pythia, the philosophers face a new kind of silence. This quiet moment at Delphi becomes less about divine revelation and more about personal reckoning. They stand at an intellectual precipice, their expectations, built up over years of rigorous questioning, seemingly hanging in the air like incense smoke, beautiful yet heavy with unresolved tension. The greatest struggle is no longer against a faulty syllogism or even fate itself. It is against the deep-seated human desire for certainty. They have learned that seeking definitive answers is often more burdensome than accepting uncertainty. The art of detachment begins not with dramatic epiphany, but with a quiet surrender. It means recognizing the limits of knowledge, both human and divine. They realized that much of what they sought at this holy place was merely external validation for an internal quest. The mystery was never in the oracle's pronouncements, but in their own capacity to hold contradiction, to exist comfortably where logic fails. Consider the persistent urge to find a singular guiding principle for life. We wish that existence operated like a clean equation. If A happens, then B must follow. Therefore, we should expect C. This intellectual framework gives us comfort and purpose, but it makes us profoundly brittle when faced with the messiness of reality. Life rarely provides such elegant formulas. Feelings shift unexpectedly. Fortune changes direction without warning. The gods themselves often spoke in smoke-filled riddles that required layers of assumption just to make them coherent. The detachment they must cultivate is therefore a radical acceptance of unpredictability. It is the conscious decision to let go of the expectation that life owes us clarity or even happiness. They begin practicing the gentle act of simply allowing things to be what they are in this moment, without projecting grand outcomes onto them. This is not apathy, it is profound presence. This practice directly challenges the modern impulse to always plan, always optimize, and always expect a return on emotional investment. We build our lives around carefully curated trajectories, assuming that if we just push hard enough or think logically enough, success, or peace, will follow. But life does not respond to syllogisms, it responds to attention. They contemplate the nature of desire itself. Most human distress arises not from external misfortune, but from the gap between what they expect and what actually happens. When we attach our sense of self-worth or emotional security to a specific outcome, to a relationship staying together, to a certain career path succeeding, to even finding the perfect truth, we build expectations so rigid that any deviation feels like catastrophe. This is the hidden trap, valuing the prediction more than the present moment itself. The breakthrough here is realizing that by lowering the stakes of expectation, they simultaneously increase their resilience. If a cherished plan collapses, it does not feel like an existential failure. it simply becomes data. It is merely one path closed, and now the open possibilities can be observed without the pressure of fulfilling a pre-written script. This newfound detachment allows them to view life not as a sequence of problems needing solutions, but as a boundless dialogue requiring only attentive participation. They learn that true freedom resides in this very ambiguity. The gift of Delphi was teaching them that wisdom is not a treasure chest filled with answers. It is the empty space where expectations used to reside. It is the willingness to be unguided. This internal shifting prepares them for the final journey home, making clear that their philosophical education will not end at these sacred pillars. Instead, they must carry this understanding, this grace of letting go, back into the bustling, unpredictable world. They leave seeking wisdom and finding instead a framework for gentle endurance. The freedom found in the space between one assumption and the next. After the echoing mysteries of Delphi and the tireless questioning of grand theories, something fundamental had shifted within them. The quest for monumental truths, the divine prophecy, the perfect logical proof, or even universal human purpose, seemed suddenly exhausting. They had spent so long looking outward, searching in the vast mystery of the God's will or the complexity of man's laws, that they had forgotten how to simply inhabit the space around them. Their minds, once wired for syllogisms and deep philosophical debate, were now hyper-aware, strained by the weight of every ambiguity encountered. The breakthrough arrived not with a sudden flash of divine insight, nor through a perfectly constructed argument, but in a moment of profound, utter simplicity. The setting was merely an unremarkable roadside, far from the towering altars and sacred Pythia. A bread vendor passed them, offering simple loaves, a commodity so mundane it seemed to mock their epic intellectual struggles. They paused, watching the baker's hands work, noting the faint flour dust motes catching the late afternoon sun. The attention demanded by this small transaction was absolute. They began to focus not on what they knew or what they believed, but purely on the immediate sensation of being present. This act was a radical deceleration of thought. The complex machinery that had allowed them to argue for weeks, the need to reconcile fate with free will, or logic with myth, began to quiet down. They realized that their true intellectual impasse had been constructed by the gap between expectation and reality. The memory of Delphi's cryptic whisper now seemed less like a riddle to be solved and more like a pointer, a signpost pointing inward, away from external mysteries entirely. The greatest lesson was not about controlling fate or mastering logic. It was about befriending nothing at all. It was the quiet recognition that the most valuable commodity they possessed was their unburdened attention. They watched others passing by, noting the way children laughed, uncontrolled and unfiltered, contrasting sharply with their own overly structured internal monologue. They saw couples walking hand in hand, seemingly carrying no profound philosophical revelation, just the simple weight of companionship, the rhythm of shared steps. These unexamined moments now held a deeper resonance than any sermon or oracle could provide. The desire to do something grand, to formulate the ultimate thesis statement, dissolved into a quiet appreciation for what simply is. They began to notice the quality of light changing on the stone path, the subtle variations in the smell of wild herbs, the texture of rough-spun cloth against their skin. These sensations, previously filtered out by the continuous demands of interpretation and intellectual striving, rushed back with an overwhelming clarity. The philosophical breakthrough was profoundly unphilosophical. It required no theory, only receptivity. They learned that the profound anxiety they had carried, the fear of being wrong. The pressure to synthesize a grand life purpose was rooted in trying to give meaning where none was meant to be found. Meaning was not something to be unearthed through arduous study or divine intervention. It simply flowed from paying attention. This simple act became their new discipline. To eat bread slowly enough to taste the crust, to walk quietly enough to hear the footfalls of others, to observe a sunset until its final color fades into deepening blue. These mundane acts were now imbued with immense significance. They understood that the richness of life was not measured by the depth of one's philosophy, but by the breadth and quality of one's attention to the immediate moment. This rediscovery of simple being was a radical act of intellectual humility. It meant accepting that profound wisdom could be found in the gap between thoughts, in the stillness after argument, or within the pleasure of fully engaging with an ordinary meal. The drama of human existence did not require a cosmic explanation. It simply required presence. They were shedding the mantle of perpetual seekers, trading the dizzying chase for definitive answers, for the solid peace that comes from acknowledging the inherent, beautiful imperfection of the now. They finally walked away from the sacred precinct. The journey back down the hillside felt vastly different from their approach. Before, Delphi had been a place of overwhelming external force, a towering monument to divine mystery and intellectual confrontation. Now, it was simply geography, stone paths winding through olive groves and scrubland, imbued with a silence that no longer felt empty, but complete. The monumental questions they had pursued within the oracle's shadow did not vanish when their feet left sacred ground. Instead, they underwent a transformation. They carried Delphi not as a memory of whispers and ambiguous pronouncements, but as an internal architecture, a framework for understanding the world that was newly formed inside them. The external search had ended, giving way to a profound, self-contained homecoming. They understood now that true wisdom was neither delivered by the Pythia's trance, nor perfected within the syllogistic precision of the academy lecture hall. It resided in the space between one thought and the next, in the quiet moments when external expectation dissolved into mere observation. The destination had never been a specific answer. It was always the state of being capable of asking better questions. This understanding fundamentally altered their approach to life. They realized that having spent so much time seeking ultimate answers, the absolute truth about fate, or the precise will of the gods, they had often paralyzed themselves with the weight of hypothetical knowledge. All this searching for certainty had led not to resolution, but to a peculiar kind of peace, the calm acceptance of perpetual incompleteness. The wisdom gained at Delphi was ultimately one of profound self-trust and disciplined attention. It was the rejection of all external anchors, the pronouncements, the god's will, even their own meticulously crafted philosophical theories, in favor of the immediate reality presented to them. They were learning how to live in the state they had been studying, a perpetual present tense. This meant a radical reevaluation of purpose. Previously, their lives seemed guided by grand narratives, the mission to uncover cosmic laws, the obligation to map the heavens, or the necessity of solving man's deepest existential riddle. Now, those grand blueprints felt arbitrary, magnificent perhaps, but ultimately restrictive. The self became the primary subject of study, and the immediate act of living became the curriculum. Consider the sheer effort it took just to walk, balancing the stones, feeling the slight grit underfoot, noting the play of light through the canopy of leaves. Before Delphi, they would have filtered this experience through metaphor. This path symbolizes life's journey. These rocks represent unavoidable struggle. They saw the meaning and dismissed the raw sensation. But now, the simple act of moving held its own integrity. The meaning was inherent in the movement itself. The philosophical homecoming wasn't a moment of sudden enlightenment marked by a single revelation. It was a continuous habit of stripping away layers of assumption. It was the conscious practice of being undistracted. If they were discussing politics, they stopped trying to predict the inevitable outcome. They focused instead on the immediate integrity of the argument, listening only for the sincere intent behind the words. If they encountered sorrow, they did not automatically search for its metaphysical cause, its connection to fate or divine displeasure. They simply felt the weight of the grief in their chest and tended to that reality directly. This was intellectual rigor without theory. It was emotional resilience divorced from doctrine. To be present with feeling, regardless of reason's judgment, became the truest act of philosophy. The challenge now shifted completely. It was no longer about what Delphi could tell them or what the Academy demanded they know. The question moved inward. How do I live well right here, carrying this profound understanding of uncertainty? How do I build a life that honors the ambiguity without becoming paralyzed by it? They emerged from the sacred valley, not as sages armed with definitive pronouncements, but as thoughtful wanderers equipped with an internal stillness. They had learned to accept contradiction, to hold in mind both the rigid logic and the graceful surrender of unanswerable mystery simultaneously. This intellectual flexibility was their most valuable inheritance. The river of life flowed on, indifferent to their theories or their previous anxieties about destiny, and they were no longer fighting its current. Instead, they learned to ride it, accepting the bends, the sudden shallows, and the deep pools of unexpected calm. Their deepest realization was that peace is not a conclusion reached after solving all problems. It is the ongoing negotiation with reality as it unfolds, knowing that every single moment holds enough complexity, ambiguity, and grace to sustain life in itself. They were home within themselves, finding wisdom in the quiet rhythm of continued existence. The journey through the sacred lands of Greece has led us to a powerful understanding. We once sought grand answers at Delphi, answers etched by cryptic oracles, responses whispered into a haze of smoke and mystery. We spent weeks trying to fit profound human meaning into the rigid certainty of syllogisms, attempting to build predictable logical structures around the unpredictable utterance of the gods. Yet, we found that attempts to capture ultimate truth in a neat academic formula only resulted in deeper confusion. We learned how exhausting it is to live under the pressure of needing absolute knowledge or the necessity of a final, definitive answer. The divine whispers taught us not what to know, but how not to struggle so hard against what we cannot control. We discovered that our anxieties were seldom caused by external forces, the unpredictable whims of fate, or even the gods themselves, but rather by the judgments we layered upon those events. This understanding led us away from the towering mystery at Delphi and towards a much more intimate space, the self. True wisdom began not with a grand prophecy, but with a quiet conversation, turning our gaze inward. The oracle had forced us to look outward, demanding that we consider fate, desire, and necessity. But it was within the silence of our own minds that we found the deepest revelations. The greatest realization is this: philosophy is not a destination you reach, nor a single truth delivered at a sacred site. To believe it is merely an answer is to misunderstand its very nature. Instead, philosophy must be embraced as a perpetual conversation, a continuous, questioning dialogue with ourselves. It is the act of refusing intellectual complacency. Imagine life itself as this unending dialogue. Every moment presents us with questions, whether about our own motives or the meaning of an unfamiliar experience. To live philosophically means to maintain that state of inquiry. It demands a refusal to become comfortable in any single belief system, a continuous skepticism toward one's own presumed certainties. This conversation is fundamentally marked by growth. Growth does not happen when we finally arrive at a perfect, universal truth. It happens when we embrace the contradiction inherent in existence. We must learn that holding two opposing ideas, say, profound certainty and total ambiguity, within the same mind is not a flaw. It is the very engine of wisdom. We are constantly negotiating contradictions, the need for order against the chaos of reality, the desire for connection versus the necessity of self-reliance. Each time we allow ourselves to struggle with this tension, each time we refuse to settle for intellectual neatness, we engage in a profound act of becoming more human and more wise. The challenge is to carry the quiet understanding gleaned from Delphi, the realization that certainty is an illusion, and integrate it into every aspect of daily life. We must approach the mundane acts, like sharing bread or watching a simple sunset, with the same diligent attention we once reserved for divine mystery. Because in those small, unscripted moments lies the true weight and gravity of existence. This self-dialogue requires profound discipline. It means stopping the habitual narratives, the automatic stories we tell ourselves about who we should be, or what life owes us. It means pausing when fear tells us that an unknown future is unbearable, recognizing instead that the only thing truly belonging to us, and therefore the only place where our true freedom lies, is this breath right now. We learn that self-knowledge is not a single flash of insight, but the cumulative practice of asking better questions. It is the consistent habit of examining our assumptions, questioning our deepest desires, and acknowledging the boundaries of what we can truly command. This constant intellectual exercise prevents us from becoming rigid, preventing us from turning into dogmas that claim final authority on life. The philosopher who finally understands this principle does not retreat to a shrine seeking answers. Instead, they step back into the world, into the market square, across the fields, and into their own troubled thoughts, equipped with a revolutionary sense of curiosity. They carry Delphi within them, not as a monument of mystery, but as a mindset of perpetual inquiry. To be truly philosophical is simply to be perpetually learning.